Hello all, this is the second video just to have a little quick run through about paper 2 ready for Friday. I'm just going to go through again some of those basic things to make sure that we know what we're doing with the paper. A few little hinters and pointers about not necessarily what I think might come up, but certainly what to do for each one, a little bit about timings as well, and really how to get to grips with paper 2, which I think a lot of people think is, the hardest paper. So let's have a little look through what to do. Okay then, so same as before, we're just going to make sure that we understand all of the bits on the cover of the paper. So as you can see, I'm going to use last year's paper 2 again. Again, for those of you who are still not quite sure, paper 2 has approaches, biopsychology and research methods in. Now, looking at the weighting, it's a little bit different this time. The biopsychology and approaches section are each worth 24 marks each one, but your research methods section is worth 48 marks. It's double marks in this paper for research methods because it's a really, really important topic. Now, whilst we're on that, I just want to point out a few bits here. So overall, across your 3 papers, up to 40% of your grade could be assessed on your research methods content, okay? Now, 48 out of the 288 possible marks, so the 48 for the research methods section, actually only equates to about 17% of your overall research methods possible content. What that means is that there could be up to 23% of questions or points or marks that could be assessed on research methods outside of the research methods section. So you've had paper 1 already, there was a little bit in there, so that would have equated to, a certain percentage. I will hopefully tally up how much I think was already in there and add that on, so then we can have a little think about what we could expect to see, certainly in paper 3, in terms of the amount of research methods style questions they might ask. Remember, they could wipe out an entire topic and put it in context to research methods, or research methods in context to that topic. So it's something worth considering to make sure that we are not forgetting research methods as soon as this paper is done. Right, moving on then. So again, same bits as before. Things like you can have a calculator. Please do not forget your calculators, okay? This has got research methods in as 48 marks. Why you would try and do any of that without a calculator, I don't know. Again, paper 2, you're going to answer all of the questions into this booklet. So please, please, please make sure that you do everything in here. And as I mentioned in the last video, the fact that you need to do all of your working out in here, because I can't mark anything that I can't see. All right, so do it all in here. Don't put a cross through it, because that way it can still be credited. All right. And again, this idea of answering continuous prose, certainly for any extended questions, almost treat your sentences like bullet points, yes, but they need to be in complete sentences. You need to be showing good quality English. And in particular for this paper, with all of that sciencey stuff in there, you need to be showing your showing off your specialist vocabulary, really. Now, as we go through, again, it's a 2-hour paper, 120 minutes therefore over 96. That's going to be 1.25 minutes per mark. Now, I highly recommend you spend about 30 minutes on approaches, 30 minutes on biopsychology, and that leaves then an hour to do research methods. Now, again, same kind of procedure as last time, but I've had a little think about the best way to get through this paper. Now, I think it would be best, same as before, you go through, you read all of those questions start to finish, and you don't try and answer anything until you've finished having a little skim read of the booklet. I then recommend that you highlight any questions that you think would be really, really good. So again, looking at these colours here, in yellow, I would highlight anything which looks like a really easy question that you could do super quickly. And as you're going through, I'd have your other 3 colours, your green for AO1, your blue for AO2, and your AO3 for all of that evaluation orange content there. Just to remind yourself as you're going through that you should be really addressing that assessment objective as you go through that question. The next thing you need to think about is what order are you going to do things in. Now, I think it might be best to build up your confidence, do all of approaches and all of biopsychology first, doing all the ones you know, and then having a go at the 16 marker, if there is one, doing a 16 marker at the end of biopsychology and approaches. Once you've then done that, then it's time to move on to research methods and really tackling spending that full hour tackling that scenario. So you need to really read through that scenario. I would pull out all the bits that are relevant to it in there, really break that up, and I'll show you a bit about that in a moment. And most importantly, make sure you draw this table as soon as possible. Get that out. So carrots should come, mashed with swede, under roast potatoes, Noi. Let's make sure that we're getting that in there straight away, so we don't have to think about it when it comes back to it. And then finally, once you finish research methods, I would then leave yourself, a few minutes, which you'll probably have from the shorter questions, not taking you so long. I would spend a few minutes going back through and, just reassuring yourself, really, look how much you've already achieved. Okay, so a little bit different to the last video. This time I am going to run through a little bit about some of the questions, not necessarily my answers, but I have put some answers onto all of these, so please feel free to pause the video, take a picture, screenshot, whatever, if you'd like some sample answers there. Right, first thing to point out then, approaches, your first section, approaches. Please do not forget origins of psychology. That is the first little bit you would have looked at to do with approaches, but it is very, very important. They can well ask you about, Wundt, introspection, all of that stuff comes under approaches. So don't walk into that exam without knowing what those bits are. Then you've got the obvious bits, so social learning theory, behaviorism, cognitive approach, biological, psychodynamic, humanism, and again, you will potentially be asked about comparing those approaches, so make sure you're going in having had some practice at looking at the differences and the similarities between each of those approaches. What does one do that the other doesn't? Is one more reductionist or holistic than the other? Now, the approaches in themselves are actually very simple. I think, it's one of the few bits in the course that you can just learn and just know it. Now, for that reason, please do not expect to get a question of outline and evaluate the behaviourist assumption. It's just not going to happen, okay? It's all going to be an application to something. So the best thing you could be doing is your revision in the lead up to Friday is applying your knowledge into a variety of scenarios, doing practice questions, a little bit like this one here, because it's just not going to be as simple as tell me what this approach is. Okay, so in this paper, you've got a little question here looking at explain why John's genotype will not reveal whether he will suffer from Alzheimer's disease as a result of that little situation there. Now you can see I've done, my little highlights in blue for AO2 marks to remind myself everything I say needs to be in relation back to John. I can't just tell you about genotypes. I can't explain what a phenotype is. I need to absolutely put this into the context of John and the case of the Alzheimer's. Now you'll notice as we go through, I've put next to them in red little numbers, and that's roughly how long you should be spending on each of these questions. So for a 4 marker, you should be spending about 5 minutes to complete that, okay? You may well do it faster, in which case great, you can save that certainly for research methods, but in the other papers perhaps 16 markers may demand more time. Now this question, describe the structure of the personality according to the psychodynamic approach. This is about the only question I've seen which does just tell you, or does just ask for you to tell me what is one element of an approach. So really easy, 4 marks there. So I've put here in my yellow with a big smiley face, look, this is a really easy question. I could do this almost with my eyes closed. So make sure that I'm going to do this one first and get it out the way and save myself some time. Now notice here, they are trying to be a little bit deceptive with the amount of space they give you. So this is a 4 marker again. Look at the difference in the space, the amount of lines they've given you in comparison to this 4 marker. Now, I would hazard a guess that perhaps this is a little bit of an AQA trick to try and see if you're writing to the lines or are you writing to the marks. You should only be writing however much you actually need to write. Don't let this amount of lines put you off, okay? It really needs to be seen as whatever it needs to be your version. Okay, so there was a 16 marker in last year's approaches section, and it's one of these AO2 16 markers where it's got this little scenario about Tatiana, and talked about her low self-esteem and her use of social media. Now, the question, outline and evaluate the humanistic approach. Now, wouldn't that be lovely? Just outline and evaluate the humanistic approach. But it's not going to happen. This isn't AS, it's certainly not GCSE. So they're going to bung a little bit on the end there. So refer to Tatiana's behaviour in your answer. Now, 16 marks. As soon as I see that there's some writing and then there's a 16 marker, I know straight away this is going to be 6 plus 4 plus 6. 6 AO1 marks are available, 4 AO2 and 6 AO3. I then know that we're going to use our Pele structure that we've talked about. So I'm going to make my point, I'm going to expand on my point, maybe bring in some studies or bring in some kind of reference there. Then I'm going to link it back into this stem. Okay, so I think I'm talking about this because in this scenario, Tatiana has said blah, 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 blah. And then I'm going to evaluate whether or not I think that is an accurate depiction of whatever. So just a little headshot. Like I said, I'm not going to go into any depth here. That's not what this video is about. But a little overview. I would structure this into 2 halves. I would do 1 half about Maslow's hierarchy of needs to outline the humanistic approach. And I would spend about 3 marking AO1 points for the point and the expand on that. You need to make 2 kind of comments about how that links into Tatiana. So you get really a mark for pulling it out of here and a mark for making sure it is relevant to what you've been saying here. And then 3 evaluation points. You need to make a minimum of 3 evaluation points about whether or not you think the humanistic approach is good and whether or not this is relevant, etc. Compare that to another approach. Could one approach be better at explaining Tatiana's behaviour or whatever? And then my second half, I'm going to talk about incongruence and talk about Rogers and the self, the ideal self, the actual self, perceived self, etc. as my expansion. And I'm going to pick out, well, it's because of this conditional positive regard about how Tatiana seems to get her conditional regard from whether or not people message her and things like that. And so that is what builds up her self-esteem, and then we could, talk about the evaluations of that there. So just a little, really the focus here is that when you see a 16 marker, spend that time breaking it down. Now, you've got about 20 minutes to do a 16 marker. I would absolutely spend the first 4 minutes of that planning, if not longer, because I think if you can do a really good job planning, then it would take you a blink of an eye to just write that up. Get all your thinking out of the way, and then do your writing up on that. Okay, now we're into my favourite topic of all, which I appreciate certainly my students are not the biggest fan of, but biopsychology. Now in this one you should be thinking about your knowledge of things like the nervous system, so including your neurons, synaptic transmission, all of that stuff, and the endocrine system, fight or flight response. Now you would have covered that in AS anyway to do with the approaches, so that stuff should be easy peasy lemon squeezy by now. The bits that often baffle people are things like localization of function, a bit about split brain research in there as well, Sperry and all of that, plasticity and recovery, and then ways of investigating the brain. Don't overlook that. It looks like such a small part, but it's a nice, easy way of gaining some marks if you know that well. And then finally, the biological rhythms, where people seem to have a little panic about all the words. But they are just words, okay? So let's just focus on what they mean rather than the spellings and what that all actually means. So in this biopsychology section from last year, the first question was explain the process of synaptic transmission. Now, to me, that's a little dream of a question, as it should be to you. If you have learnt, certainly my students will have learned a list almost of what happens from here to here in the process of synaptic transmission. You should have something that looks a lot like this. Now, explain the process of synaptic transmission. I've also seen the processes and parts or whatever. Really what they're focusing on, I think, is the language, the terminology. This is a chance for you to show off that it's your specialist terminology. So don't say things like the bits float across to the other side. Well, that's not very scientific. We're talking about neurotransmitters diffusing across the synaptic cleft and binding to the active receptor site of the postsynaptic neuron. So we need to make sure that we're using all of that fancy terminology to make sure we're getting the marks that they are looking for. Now, here we had a nice little application part. Looking at a little scenario here of Lotta, and again straight away, because I can see Lotta's grandmother, it's a good indicator to me that it's going to be 4 marks for AO2. But even more so than that, it says using your knowledge of. So anytime you're using your knowledge of one thing and applying it into another thing, that has to be AO2. Now, right from the beginning, straight to the left hemisphere, I'm already thinking, and I'm going to scribble this down, okay, so left hemisphere, well, that controls right body. That's where my language centers are. They're probably going to ask me something about this. Again, 4 marks. I'm going to spend 5 minutes on this, and I'm going to put together a little answer that addresses those 2 things that came to my mind immediately. 4 marks, those 2 are the most obvious things. It says here about Broca's area and the motor cortex. That confirms that it's about these 2 things. And so I'm going to spend about 2 marks talking about this and 2 marks talking about Broca's aphasia. It then carries on this little scenario, still talking about Lotta and her grandmother. And now we're talking about plasticity and functional recovery. Again, it says using your knowledge. So that's 4 AO2 marks. And I'm going to spend about 5 minutes with this as well. Now remember, check about the space, because this doesn't look very much, certainly in comparison to this, for the same amount of marks. If I'd actually turned over, I would have seen there was more space. So make sure you will see that when you do your pre-reading before you start answering, just to remind yourself about, perhaps how much you should be saying, and that you shouldn't be stunting yourself just because you haven't turned over the page. Now, the biopsychology section of this for last year was very much all about application of knowledge. And again, please do expect that you are A-level candidates, you are not GCSE. I don't want to know how much you know, I want to know what you can do with it. So please make sure that you are preparing yourself by doing practice questions and not just regurgitating notes. Now this one was actually just a nice little research methods question. Explain one disadvantage of obtaining quantitative data in this. Now I will point out it's a little bit of a red herring question. This is AO2, and I know this because it's got a little scenario above it. But that word explain would suggest it's AO1, and the fact that you're talking about a disadvantage would suggest it's AO3. But no, in this one, because it's got a little scenario, it's actually very much an AO2 question. Now moving on, again it's AO2 here because now we're applying our knowledge about research methods into this kind of scenario that they've given, and then with a very simple question about writing a couple of questions, quantitative and qualitative. Now 2 marks, you need to be spending about 2.5 minutes on those. Now to be truthful, I think you could do those much faster, providing your mind was straight on action and you gave yourself a skim read through at the beginning. They then went into a lovely little 8 marker actually, outline and evaluate 1 or more ways of studying the brain. Now A-level, 8 markers, you should be looking at 3 AO1 points and 5 AO3 points. That should be the weighting that you are writing to. So I started talking about fMRIs, and then I thought, just to make sure I've got enough, I'm going to chuck in a bit about postmortems as well. So here's my AO1 here. And then here I've kind of just thrown together some AO3. Now note, I wouldn't normally do this. I'd normally do it as a little peel paragraph, and certainly please do that for the 16 markers. But as I've said before, that in this situation certainly, the most appropriate thing was to say, one does this, and then talk about the actual what's good and bad about them, and certainly the influence that they've had. Okay. And again, note the space here. Bear in mind a 4 marker is normally about this big. For an 8 marker, they've given you 2 pages. Now, don't be put off by that. Like I said, write to what you need. Do what you've got to do. Don't get put off by that space issue. Now we're into research methods, okay? Now remember what I said before, I would go through and I'd highlight the bits that I think are important. Now to me this is very wordy, I don't like dealing with too many words, and so I did my version of a little shorthand next to it so I know exactly what's going on. So I can see this is repeated measures design. I had 5 people doing the music condition and 5 people doing the no music condition. They went away for a week and then they came back and they swapped over which condition they were in. Easy peasy. All this other stuff I can get if I need it, but right now I understand what's going on before I enter into this. So very nice first little question there for 1 mark. Identify the type of experiment, multiple choice, easy peasy. This bit here, shade 1 box only. Please don't get caught out. Don't just ignore this up here. Do not get caught out with this. So many people keep putting a cross in the box. Now, if you look here, putting a cross in a box suggests that you don't want that answer. They won't give it to you unless you put that little shade. So make it really clear, play the game, you've just got to put a shade in it. 1 mark would be about 1.25 minutes. Now, in truth, shading that box is not going to take you that long. Even thinking an answer to this question won't take you that long. But I think you need to account for the fact that the time it takes to read this. So actually, 1.25 minutes is probably about right. Okay, so moving on to the other questions. Identify the operationalised dependent variable in this study. Operationalised variable. If I just said running time running, that wouldn't be operationalised. I need to say that it's the time in seconds. What am I actually measuring? That is the operationalisation of it. Again, 2 marks, about 2.5 minutes. Here's just a little question about histograms. Why would you not use a histogram? So again, just that standard numerical mathsy stuff. You don't even need an A-level in psychology to know that. You should know that from GCSE maths. Again, identifying an appropriate chart here. Now here, it's actually AO3, even though previously it's been AO2 because we're in application to this scenario. This one's actually AO3 because now it's asking for you to make a comment. So what is a more appropriate graph? That's an opportunity for you to be evaluative by suggesting what you would have done better. So it's really important that you just consider that as you go through, not so much for this question, but certainly for this one. So 4 marker here, 2 of which are for AO2 parts, and 2 are for AO3. And again, that AO3 comes from suggest about the. It's asking you to comment, okay? It's asking you to show your knowledge of something here. And obviously, there has to be some AO2 here because it's for this particular situation. Okay, little mathsy one here, just calculating the percentage decrease. Just make sure you show your workings out. I can't emphasize it enough. There are 4 marks available. You will get 1 just for your answer. That varies depending on the mark scheme, but show your working out because it's the safest thing that you could do here. Okay, this question then, give 3 reasons why the researcher used a related t-test and whether or not the results are significant. 5 marks. Well, it says give 3 reasons, so I know that 3 of them are for that, and therefore the remaining 2 must be about why or not it's significant. Oh, why did they use a related t-test? Don't even need to think about it because my cheeky little table back at the front, it will show me the answers to that. So why did they use a related t-test? Well, it's because it's a test of difference, it's related design, repeated measures, and it's interval level data. So job done, I've got those 3 marks straight away. Were the results significant? Well, this was handy. They even gave you the rule here, so you don't even need to do any thinking here. So the results are not significant at the 0.05 level because the observed value was less than the critical value and actually it needed to be greater than. Okay, question 17 then. What is meant by a type 2 error? Suggest why psychologists normally use the 5% level of significance in their research. 2 marks available for the type 2 and 1 mark available for talking about why we use 5%. Remember, the best way to remember which way around it goes, for your type 1, type 2 errors is to remember that your type 1 error is actually when you wrongly accept your alternative hypothesis, so type 1 for H1, and therefore type 2 is just the other one. It's when you wrongly accept your null hypothesis, okay? Now, once you've got that, it's an easy peasy job. So type 2 errors are false negatives, where the difference is considered to not be significant as you wrongly accept the null hypothesis there. And then just to finish off that question, explain why psychologists normally use the 5% level. Well, the 5% level is the best balance between committing a type 1 or a type 2 error. So lovely stuff, job done there. Okay, this one, identify an extraneous variable that would have affected the results of this study, suggest why it would have been important to control this extraneous variable, and how it could have been controlled. They seem to liken research methods, putting almost like 3 questions into one here. So for 3 marks, you actually had quite a lot you needed to say. So you can see the answer there, talking at how making sure really that you're commenting on an extraneous variable and not muddling up with a confounding variable. Remember, extraneous is anything extra that doesn't vary systematically with the IV, and confounding is something that does vary systematically with the IV, but obviously both still have an effect on your DV. So here I've talked about the temperature in the room, the climate of the room at the time. They need to make sure that is kept the same. They could do that by using a temperature control room for each one. Peer review. Do not neglect peer review in your revision because absolutely it's very important. It's what we do, it's what makes us a science, so please make sure that you refer to that in your revision as well. Again, a bit of a stinky question in the sense that it wants both the process and the purpose. They could have equally have just done a 2 or 3 marker on the purpose of peer review. So make sure you've looked at all of that there before you head on in. And then another little application one here, so explain why it is more appropriate for a psychologist to use an observation than a questionnaire for this scenario. And obviously that's getting at how self-reports would actually have loads of desirability bias and how there might even be demand characteristics. So observations have absolutely overcome that. And then the final question, 21. In all of the specimens and indeed the last year's paper as well, they've all put some kind of plan and investigation in. So perhaps make sure that you're familiar with this. 12 marks, you want to spend about 15 minutes on this. Now, really nicely, they've broken it down into 4 key areas that you want you to look at. So for 12 marks, I'm going to aim for 3 points for each one, nice and easy. It's a 6+6 in this one because you have 6 marks for your application of your research methods knowledge to this situation and 6 marks for justifying why you are doing that. So again, making your comment. So you can see here, I've talked about, I'm going to use covert, I'm going to use naturalistic, I'm going to use participant, and what exact behavioural categories am I going to use here. I've talked about the actual sampling that I'm going to use and then how I'm going to check the reliability, well, inter-observers. I might record it and then do the inter-observers actually, and I would correlate those scores. And if you want to be really fancy, you could even talk about running a test like Spearman's to check significance of that correlation. Again, just watch out for the space here. So you have this space, you have this bit, you have this bit. I don't think you need all that much actually for that 12 marker. So again, write to the space you need, not what is there. Certainly don't get fazed by it. And that's the end of the paper. Okay, so that's the kind of whiz through of that paper. It's quite a long video now, I'm afraid, but I had a few comments and things that people wanted me to actually go through paper 2, what to do with each question. So I hope that's been helpful. If you have any further questions, please, certainly for my students, post it on Edmodo and then I can answer them directly there. For anybody else, there's been a few subscribers for people I don't teach, and that's brilliant. Please post your questions, and I will try and put together a live. I'll probably do a live Thursday at some point, or maybe very early Friday morning, but we'll see. Maybe comment and let me know if that would be useful to you. Certainly at this stage, it's, you know, what do you guys need, and I will do my best to provide something. Now, in true Miss Mobley fashion, I prepared yet another cheesy motivational speech for you for paper 2. Watch out for all the puns, they are my specialty. So, the way you approach this exam could influence the skew of results. You've worked hard. Maguire knows that you have shaped your brain to excel at these tasks. Don't be a Freud and repress your feelings. Instead, channel them for self-actualization. You're stressed. Your HPA axis is sending your ANS crazy. But it could be worse. You could have a splitting brain ache. This infradian rhythm of exam season will soon be over. Success is our mode and it is externally valid. And we all believe in you, don't you, bro? Psychology is empirical and predictable. So play on the Hawthorne effect and give them what they are looking for. Good luck.